Okay, are we ready to get started? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you good.
Okay. So like Dr. Butler said, my name is Sheena Aikens. I'm the Deputy Chief Procurement Officer for Operations here at Cook County. I'm really happy to be working with Office of Contract Compliance and helping vendors prepare for solicitations, understanding our solicitations and the procurement process in general. So we're going to go through episode 2 today, which is the RFP and RFQ process end to end. We'll start with the most complex form of solicitations and work our way down to IFBs and amendments and things like that. Um, we'll also dive into in one of the later sessions the actual documents for our solicitation. So if you guys had questions about those, we won't be addressing those in detail today, but there is a session set aside for understanding our documents, the submittal requirements, how to complete them, where to find them. We will dive into that as well, just an FYI. For the sake of this session, like I said, we're going to be discussing the RFP and RFQ process from beginning to end. You guys are free to ask questions throughout the presentation, and I know Dr. Butler will monitor the chat just to make sure I'm not missing any. But like she said, please make sure that you are on mute. And we'll just dive right in. So RFPs and RFQs, the entire process from end to end. Okay. So like I said, today we'll be discussing the request for qualifications, which is the RFQ, and the request for proposals. For the sake of this meeting, we're going to start the discussion at the point which vendors become involved. So that's when we post to the public. Keep in mind, there is a lot that goes on behind the scene in preparation for these types of solicitations, because again, they are the two most complex forms of solicitations that we do. But the back end information isn't as crucial to vendors as when we post. So we're going to dive into each of these type of procurements when the vendor gets involved.
Hey, Sheena,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. So people are still saying they can't hear you. I can hear you fine, but people are still saying that they can't hear you. So I don't know if you have the ability to
Yeah,
increase the
I've turned my volume all the way up. I'll try to talk a little closer to my headset. Is that better?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So we'll dive into the first part, which is the request for qualifications, the RFQ. So what is an RFQ? It's a document that is used by a procurement entity to obtain statements of qualifications from potential vendors. So vendors are not providing a whole proposal. They're really providing what is similar to a resume. So we'll post a specific scope of work or a project that needs to be addressed, and then vendors are welcome to let us know why they're qualified to do this type of service. It's typically used as a screening step to establish a pool of vendors that are qualified. So again, with the RFQ, similar to an RFP, there may be multiple vendors awarded. However, with an RFQ, that vendor pool will rotate depending on the need. And like I said, it's used to compare the expertise of potential vendors. So just to make sure that each company or firm that is providing a qualification has the wherewithal and the know-how to perform the scope that we are asking for. That's what we're looking for. All responses or qualifications are evaluated by a committee with an RFQ. The process for the evaluation is similar to an RFP, but there are some slight differences, and I'll get into that later on in this session. But the main thing about the RFQ versus the RFP is price is not a factor for determining award. We don't ask for pricing at the onset or when it's posted, when the RFQ is posted to the public. Once the short list or the most qualified firms are identified, we'll start negotiating pricing after that point. A lot of times vendors will provide us their hourly rate as a reference, but that's not the final price that will be baked into the contract, if that makes any sense. So pricing can be submitted, but it's not considered for award until after that pool has been established. That pool is rotated based on need. So for example, we may, and I mentioned in one of the last sessions, we may have our Department of Transportation and Highways, DOTH. They may post an RFQ for road development or road pavement or something like that. And we may know that a lot of streets or roads around Cook County need to be addressed. We just may not know when that need may arise, right? A pothole may erupt after a storm or after a car accident. We won't know that until it happens, and that's what the pool is for. Every time a need arises, we'll send a certain vendor to that area or on that project to make sure that it's completed, and we'll rotate to keep the process going and make sure everyone gets a chance to actually fulfill the service. The resulting contract of an RFQ is what we call a task order, sometimes a work order, depending on the nature of the scope. That becomes the contract. And like I said before, they are typically used for our construction contracts or road and highway contracts, things like that. That's what the RFQ is typically used for. One thing that we did point out in the previous session was the new process that we're doing, which is called the RFI, or the request for information, where we're posting the RFI to vendors to give us information on the type of services that we could benefit from using, by giving us information on best practices, what's out there, how the need can be met, and then we'll post the RFQ and select the pool based off of that. That's something new that we're doing, but we are still doing that. So the RFQ RFI process is pretty similar, and they go hand in hand as of right now in the way that we are requesting qualifications from our vendors. Okay. So the overall phases of the RFQ process, again, there's the public posting for 30 days, and I'll dive into some of the series of events that happen during that posting. After the posting, after responses are due and the posting has closed, the buyer conducts a responsiveness check, and we'll get into that also. And then there's the evaluation of the qualifications, and it's a little bit different than an RFP, as in there are different steps within the evaluation phase. So step one of the evaluation for an RFQ is the committee will evaluate the qualifications and establish that shortlist, right? So the vendors that are most qualified to provide the service based on the resumes or the qualifications that they submitted. The shortlisted vendors will be invited to participate in an interview. This is similar to the oral presentations for an RFP, but I believe what they're asking for may be slightly different as far as the qualifications of each vendor. And then after the short list is fully baked, the firms will be asked to provide a staffing level of effort by task and by staff. That's when they'll be asked to provide their hourly rate and the total cost for the project based on that interview and what the OCPO and the vendor determines would best work for this project. Right, so that pool of vendors that we select is called the most qualified respondent. You'll see a lot of that verbiage in our RFQ document, but that's what the vendor pool and the MQR is used interchangeably. And at that point, once they are selected, like I mentioned, that's when OCPO will reach out to finalize the contract value and negotiate the terms of whatever that task order agreement is. After that portion is fully baked and we have our pool with our negotiated pricing and terms, that's when we'll start the supplemental vetting of each vendor. We'll start the background checks and the compliance review. If the contract value is $150,000 or above, it has to be approved by our Board of Commissioners. So there's an additional meeting that has to happen before we can, additional meeting and approval that has to happen before we can actually notify vendors of award, and we'll get into that in a second also. After the board approves the recommendation for award, that's when the task order or the contract is created, and the CPO can execute that contract. The CPO is not able to fully sign. He's the last signature on the contract, but he's not able to sign until the board has actually approved the award. And once the CPO has fully executed the agreement, the contract, and the purchase order, if applicable, is sent to the awarded vendors, along with the, like I said, the task order information, and that's when it's okay for the vendors to start the work. The estimated timeline for an RFQ is typically 6 to 9 months, depending on the nature of the scope, the complexity of the project, and the number of qualification packages that we do receive. Okay. So next we'll get into the responsiveness check. And as we mentioned in one of the last meetings, responsive and responsible are two different terms, although you may see them used side by side, they mean two different things. Responsiveness means that the vendor or the qualification package that has been submitted complies with all of the submittal requirements that we were asking for. So basically, what the buyer is checking for when it comes to responsiveness is that the vendor submitted all of the documents that we asked them to, and that includes the MBE utilization plan, certificate of insurance, any applicable attachments and pricing sheets, any of the qualification certifications that we were asking for, they must be submitted with your response to be considered responsive. Right, so any response that is missing, any of those required documents may be deemed non-responsive, and we don't want that to happen. So we want to make sure that you guys look at the list of submittal requirements that are posted in the document and make sure you submit everything that we are asking for so that you can be considered for further evaluation. Because non-responsive proposals or qualifications are not further considered for evaluation and will not move past the phase where we are evaluating. Okay. So some of the requirements of an RFQ, as I mentioned, when it comes to those submittal documents, are your cover letter, the certifications that I mentioned, and that can be the certification saying that, hey, I am the vendor that does this type of work. We are qualified to do this work. Another certification that may be asked for is your financial stability, stating that we have the financial stability to uphold this contract until we are paid and after we get paid. Because we want to make sure that vendors are stable enough to perform the contract over the life of the agreement, so we don't have to terminate or have any issues for that reason. The qualifications and executive summary and approach, the org structure and key personnel, the project showcase. So this is how you demonstrate the way you're going to do the work. And as I mentioned, all applicable attachments, some of our RFQs have a separate attachment A, B, and C, or 1, 2, and 3, depending on the nature of the scope. Notarized statements saying that I have read and understand the requirements and I'm able to fulfill the contract need. Those economic disclosure statements that we talked about before, that's outlining company information, ownership statements, the child support affidavit. If any of you have seen it, it's like a 13 or 14-page document with different sections that is required for the background check. The MWBE utilization plan, which is a document that compliance will review to ensure that you guys are meeting the goal as outlined in the solicitation document, and any other documents that may be requested for that project. And they'll be noted in the RFP and on Bonfire for you guys to submit with your project to be considered responsive. Okay. So after we get into, the buyer does the responsiveness check, making sure that everything has been submitted and they have fully vetted that the vendors that we are moving forward with are responsive. They have their kickoff meeting with the evaluation committee, and then they pass out the proposals for review. So what exactly is an evaluation committee? So this is a group of individuals that is established to review and score each proposal or qualification that is submitted in response to an RFP or an RFQ. And they're used to determine whether the vendor has the capabilities and the qualifications to complete the requested scope of work, right? So they're looking at what everyone has demonstrated on paper just to make sure that they're able to fulfill the contract. That's basically what the evaluation committee does. They rank and score the proposals or qualifications that have been received for each project. And the committee may consist of multiple areas of expertise. So you may have the technical reviewers. So these are the individuals that are responsible for actually scoring and commenting on each proposal. The technical reviewers are the ones who are going to make the recommendation for award, whether it's to one vendor or multiple vendors, whether or not we shortlist or whether or not we have oral presentation. All of that is determined by the technical reviewers. The committee may also consist of subject matter experts. So these are individuals who do not score or rank the proposals or qualifications, but they're there as a guide for the committee. So that's important because sometimes our committee, the committee members, since we want to make sure that the process is unbiased, we'll have members from all different areas of expertise. So there may not be, so the committee may not consist of 100% members who are from the using department or who are familiar with the contract need, just to make sure that they're being scored fairly. We don't want a biased opinion. So a lot of the times the subject matter experts are there just to make sure that the committee understands what the ask is and understand what they're reading in your proposal if they need to. But they do not score or rank any of the responses that are received. So the primary functions of the evaluation committee, like I said, are to review the proposals via the evaluation criteria that's listed in the RFP. One of the things we task the committee with doing is making sure they review each proposal separately and not compare one proposal or qualification to another. Every proposal that they look at, they're reviewing what is demonstrated on paper and giving that vendor a clean slate. And I'll get into that a little more detail later, but that's their primary role, is to review the solicitation, make sure they are aware of what the criteria are, how we're scoring each proposal, and align that scoring with the qualifications that they are looking at. They're able to discuss the questions and concerns that they have with the buyer during a consensus meeting. So every time that a committee meets, that's what's called a consensus meeting. The committee is not able to the committee is not able to discuss the proposals outside of that meeting, just to make sure that we're being transparent. There's no outside influence from any user department or agencies. They're only allowed to discuss their findings in that consensus meeting until the award is made. So there may be multiple consensus meetings depending on the nature of the scope and how many proposals received. But however many consensus meetings we have, the committee members will make sure that everyone has read the proposals thoroughly, has understood the proposals thoroughly. No one has missed anything. That's what the buyer's role in the consensus meeting is, right? And so the other function is, like I mentioned before, that the EC will develop a rank or a short list of vendors. So that could be whether it's the top 50% or all vendors who scored at 80% or 80 points or above. That can be the top 3 vendors. It just depends on what the committee decides based on the responses that were received. The committee also determines whether or not we have oral presentations, and if we do, they will interview each of the vendors in that short list just to get any additional clarity that they need, to have the vendor answer any additional questions that resulted from after they read the RFP or RFQ. But that's another role that the committee has, is to make sure that they get clarity from the vendors if they need to. And once they have all of that clarity and they fully understand the qualifications or the proposal that each vendor submitted, that's when they'll make a recommendation of award to the user department. This process can take a couple of months depending on how lengthy the proposals or the qualifications are. So just one vendors to keep that in mind. You may submit a response to an RFQ on July 1st, but you may not hear anything about the process until a few months later, because again, that responsiveness check can take a while. And the evaluation committee review can take a while too, because we want to make sure they're thoroughly looking at all these proposals to make sure we're picking the best option for Cook County, and that can take some time. And I know a lot of times, we get questions about vendors will call when they know that our solicitations are in the evaluation phase, asking for a status update or what the decision was. The buyer's not able to tell you that until after the board approves. But I just want to make sure that everyone is aware that the buyer's role in the evaluation committee is just to be the chair of the committee. They don't score, they don't rank, they don't make the decision. The committee is responsible for making the actual decision on who we should award for a given solicitation. Okay, so here is an example of some of the criteria that you will see in an RFQ. Some may be more detailed depending on the nature of the scope, but this is at a minimum. So the committee will be looking for the following things in order to determine vendor responsibility or qualifications, right? The experience, capability, and capacity of the proposed team. So that is where they're looking to make sure that whoever you're proposing will be on that project, they're making sure each of those people have the wherewithal to actually work on this project. They have the experience and the background that is necessary to complete the scope of work. Another thing that they're looking for is the quality of the work plan or the approach or your project statement, just to make sure that you understand the need and that you're demonstrating that you can actually meet that need based on your approach to whatever the scope of work we are requesting is. We're looking at the experience, qualifications, and the availability of the proposed team. So that kind of goes along with the capability statement. We're looking at the MBE participation, making sure that you're able to meet the goals. Sometimes the committee does score that, although it is reviewed by compliance. The committee wants to see that vendors have done their due diligence, because that's important for Cook County. Making sure that there are no illegal actions against the company, or if there are, that they have been disclosed. They review what those legal actions are to make a determination of vendor credibility, and then whether or not there are any conflicts of interest. So these are some of the criteria for an RFQ, and again, they differ depending on the project, but these are the ones that you will see at a minimum when looking at an RFQ. So after the RFQ has been evaluated based on the criteria that's listed, that's when we get into the background check and the utilization review, right? Oops, I'm so sorry. I moved too fast. Wait a minute. Here we go. Okay. So this part is really important too. And when we get into the meeting regarding our solicitation document templates, some of those documents are going to be really, really important for this particular phase of the process. We conduct what's called a background check, and we use the economic disclosure statement, or the EDS, primarily to do that. And what we're checking for is just to make sure that the vendor is in good standing with the Secretary of State or the state of Illinois, that the vendor doesn't owe any child support or back taxes, that the wage theft ordinance is being met, and that's a specific document in the EDS, that any familiar relationships with county officials or county employees is disclosed. If you are participating in any lobbyists, if you've donated to any officials, if you're related to any officials or employees, we need that disclosed, and we need to know that. And our Department of Ethics is responsible for reviewing and approving that. So there are a lot of things that go into that background check, and it's the reason why that EDS is so lengthy, because there are several reviews that take place with that document. Another part of that check is the compliance utilization plan review, or the UP review. So as you all know, firms are required to submit these documents with their response. And the Office of Contract Compliance will review these documents just to make sure that the vendor is meeting the goal that's outlined in the RFQ or RFP. And if they're unable to, they've demonstrated why. Compliance is looking to make sure that you've done your due diligence, that you have demonstrated good faith efforts. If you're not able to meet the actual goal in the RFQ, and if they have a list of vendors that can help you meet that goal, they'll recommend that when they're reviewing your UP, they'll reach out to you and let you all know that. But these two things happen once the vendors are selected, just to make sure that we're able to recommend a board. This is something that the board has to review also, that the background check is complete and the compliance review is approved. So after we've completed the background check and we know that our vendors is okay to move forward with certain vendors because they've passed the background check and the UP has been reviewed and approved by OCC, this is when we get into the board approval and the task order creation. And this is for an RFQ, right? So as I mentioned before, board approval is required when their contract is valued at $150,000 and above. And vendors are not notified formally of that decision until after the formal board approval. So as I mentioned before, we've had a couple of instances where the board did post the agenda for what they were going to review for award, and some of the vendors that submitted to a project looked at that particular posting and were upset because they weren't notified ahead of time. I just want to make sure everyone's aware. The buyer cannot formally let you know whether you have been awarded or not until after the board has given their final stamp of approval. Just want everyone to keep that in mind. And again, with an RFQ, the resulting contract is called a task order, and the CPO is able to execute the task order after the board has approved. So once we get that approval, that's when we start routing for signatures. And once all the signatures are fully baked, this is when the task order or the contract and purchase order are sent to the vendor and the using agency. So this is the green light for the vendor to start work. Once, not when the board approves, but once they receive the executed contract or purchase order or task order, whatever the documentation is, that's the approval for you all to move forward with working with your user departments. Were there any questions about the RFQ process at all?
I don't see any questions in the chat right now. Is there anyone who has a question? If you do, please raise your hand.
Okay.
Okay, let me see. Somebody does have their hand raised. Cornelius, feel free to come off of mute and ask your question.
Hello, everyone. Inspire LLC. In terms of the minority disclosure or participation, would if the minority is the prime, would they still have to come up with a minority utilization report?
So my understanding of that, and I know Dr. Butler may chime in on this, you can indicate that you're self-performing, which means you don't have to reach out for additional vendors. If you are a prime and you are an MBE vendor, you can indicate that on those forms. Is that a correct statement, Dr. Butler?
I'm gonna have to let me double check on that because that's certification.
Okay.
So I
Okay.
can double check on that and I will I'll chime back in before we're done to make sure that Mr. Hill has the correct answer to that. But I do believe you're correct, Sheena.
Yeah.
As long as that minority has the next codes, the scope of work and everything aligns with what the project is asking for, they can self-perform, but I'm gonna double check just to make sure it's correct.
All right, thanks, Dr. Butler. But yeah, so we'll get back to you on that, but based on what I've seen and from just knowing the RFP, RFQ process, you can indicate that you're self-performing on those forms. But again, we'll double check and get back to you for a final answer on that.
Okay, that looks like that's it, Sheena. I don't see any other questions.
Okay. Okie dokie. All right, so then I'll dive into the request for proposals or the RFP. This section is going to be slightly more lengthy because there are more steps involved with an RFQ. I'm sorry, an RFP. Although both of these are forms of complex solicitations, the RFP is the most complex form of solicitation that we do. So that's why I saved that one for last, because there are a lot more components that go along with the RFP. Okay. So what is an RFP exactly? So this is a procurement method used to solicit proposals from potential vendors for a service. So it's different from the RFQ where you're just saying, hey, I'm qualified to do this work. The RFP is where you're saying, hey, this is how I can do this work for you. This is my exact strategy, my methodology, my plan to meet this contract need. That's the difference between an RFP and an RFQ, right? So as I mentioned before, with an RFP, the scope of work is more complex in nature. So as an agency, we know the end result that we have in mind. We know the goal that we're trying to get to, but we're relying on the vendor as a subject matter expert to give us a roadmap on how to get there. And those roadmaps could be different for each vendor, which is why each proposal is evaluated just to make sure that whatever roadmap we're proposing to award actually meets the needs and is the most qualified to fulfill that contract. With an RFP, factors other than price are critical, and you have the ability to negotiate, you have the ability to negotiate with an RFP, right? So we do ask for BAFOs. The contract can be negotiated. We don't add any additional scope, but we're able to tweak the statement of work a little bit with an RFP. Price is evaluated again. So we do have a section where I'll talk about the pricing evaluation, but it's not the primary determinant for award, although it is considered. So here are the phases of an RFP. Again, similar to an RFQ, there's a posting for 30 days. And within that posting period, there's a pre-proposal conference. Vendor questions are due. The addenda is posted, and then the opportunity is closed. Once that happens, the buyer does their responsiveness check, making sure that the vendor submitted all the documents that we were asking for, the submittal requirements. The evaluation committee evaluates the proposals and the pricing and determines a short list if applicable. They also determine whether or not they're going to host oral presentations, and if they do, it's typically with the shortlisted vendors. Based on the outcome of those oral presentations, we're asked for a best and final offer. And once that best and final offer is scored and we have the final ranking and the final grades, the final scores for each vendor, the committee will make a recommendation for award or a number of awards depending on the project. And that recommendation is given to the user department. The user department has to actually approve that recommendation via a formal letter to OCPO. And once the recommended vendors are approved, we get into the background checks again, where they're looking for good standing with the state, no back taxes, no back child support, things like that, as well as the UP review. And this is where the contract negotiation is slightly different for an RFP, and I'll get into that in a second, but we do negotiate when it comes to an RFP for the contract. After that negotiation is fully baked, we go to the board if it's applicable. After the board approves, the CPO executes the contract, and then the contract and PO is sent to the vendor and the user department as a green light to go ahead and start the services. So typically an RFP will take about 9 to 12 months, depending on the complexity of scope and the number of responses received, but it's more lengthy in time because there are a lot more components that go along with an RFP versus an RFQ. Okay, so here are some of the requirements of an RFP. As I mentioned, it's evaluated in two phases. We evaluate the technical proposal first without looking at pricing, just to make sure we have fully baked that the methodology and the work plan and the proposed team is able and capable to meet the scope of work before we look at pricing. And the technical proposal consists of the cover letter, an executive summary, the qualifications of the proposer, past experience and any resumes of the team, the proposed plan of action and the implementation schedule. That's really important. Org structure and key personnel, and then again, that MWBE participation, that utilization plan, that's also reviewed, as well as the financial status of the firm. Again, we want to make sure that the firm is financially stable enough to fulfill the contract until they get paid and throughout the life of the contract. So that's part of the technical review. Once that technical review is done, then we reevaluate the pricing. So we make sure that the pricing is fair in comparison to what the scope is. We make sure that there's a correct amount of staff, that the vendors aren't overcharging, that if there's any profit that is within a certain percentage. There's a lot of things that the committee looks at when it comes to that pricing sheet. And if there are any questions about any of those things, whether it's the pricing or the technical proposal, they'll address those in the oral presentations. So those are the two key parts. The submittal documents are supplemental, and these are the documents that I keep talking about: the EDS, the ISF, your certificate of insurance, any contract exceptions, and I'll get into that later in a second, or any other supporting documents that are requested for that particular project is what the committee will be looking at and evaluating to make sure that they're picking the best vendor. Okay, so again, this is kind of repetitive, just making sure everyone understands what the committee is supposed to do. They review each proposal at face value, so they're making sure that what you've shown on paper demonstrates that you're able and qualified to fulfill the scope of work. And then they make a recommendation on those proposals based on the scoring that they've received. The buyer is the chair of that, so they're making sure that everyone is in compliance and no one's discussing anything outside in consensus meetings, that all the consensus meetings are happening as they should. That's the buyer's role. So I won't dive down into this in more detail because this is a repeat slide, but just wanted to make sure you guys are aware that the same process goes for the RFP evaluation. So some of the criteria that you guys will notice in an RFP, so first of all, the evaluation criteria is really important because it is the way that the committee is going to look at these proposals and make sure that they are selecting the best response, right? So they're only scoring based on the criteria that's listed in the RFP or RFQ document. So the criteria, what it is a set of predefined standards that guide the scoring of each proposal. And like I said, they allow the evaluation committee to assess vendor capabilities and how well the proposal meets the goals, the budget, and the service requirements, right? So that's why we look at all of the methodology as well as the pricing and all of those submittal documents that we were asking for. So the primary goal of evaluation criteria being posted in the RFP or RFQ document is, one, integrity. We want to make sure that the selection process is open, fair, and honest. So every vendor is going to be evaluated the same way based on the same criteria for their proposal. We want to make sure that client service is being met. So the criteria helps contribute to the achievement of performance because it helps the vendor see what we're looking for as far as how we're going to score, what we think is important, what we want to see in those proposals. So it's kind of like a rubric, right? It ensures competition and equal treatment for each proposal. Like I said, you're subject to the same conditions and considerations across the board. And it also provides accountability for the EC and the buyer to make sure that all proposals are being scored exactly the same way with the exact same criteria. There's no room for subjectivity when it comes to how these are scored and what's being reviewed and how they're being reviewed. So here are a couple of examples of some of the criteria that you may see in an RFP. Similar to an RFQ, but I believe with an RFP, they can be a little more lengthy. So the quality of the proposed plan of action, the project approach, project management methodology. So this is important because this is how you guys are letting us know what the roadmap is to complete the contract. So remember I said with an RFP, we know the end result we're trying to get to. We're relying on the vendor as a subject matter expert to give us that roadmap. Your proposed plan of action and methodology and approach to the management, that is where you're providing us that information. We're looking at the qualifications and experience of the proposed team. any successful work that they've done with similar agencies to Cook County or any other public agency like our sister agencies. If you've worked with government agencies before, because the requirements of government agencies are very different than the private sector, as most of y'all have probably learned or will know. We're looking at the qualifications of the key personnel specifically, so not just the overall team and what they're capable of, but the qualifications of each member on that team also is reviewed. Compliance with the MWBE firms is reviewed also, the financial stability of the proposal, and then we review the pricing to make sure it's fair and reasonable to fulfill the requested scope of work. So these are just examples of some of the criteria. Again, there may be more, and some may be more lengthy depending on the nature of the scope, but at a minimum, this is the type of criteria that you will see in an RFP. So what does this mean for you as a vendor, right? As I mentioned before, our criteria and the submittal requirements, everything that we outlined in our RFP are meant to be used as a rubric. It outlines what our committee is looking for, how they're going to score you. So this is a way for you to, this is assistance in helping you prepare your actual proposal. Because it's a guide for, you know, what we're looking for. It's a tool for vendors to assist in creating a response. And like I said, it shows the areas that are important for not only the using agency, but for the committee as well in their review of your proposal. Keep in mind too that the criteria is a minimum, right? So if you guys feel that there are things in your proposal or things about your company that you think would aid in the selection of you as a company, submit that also. You're not limited to what the criteria is asking for or what the submittal documents are asking for. That's just what we want to see at a basic level. If you have more information or more qualifications that you think will aid in being awarded, submit that along with your response as well. And I want to make sure we point that out. Just because we didn't specifically ask for it doesn't mean we want you to leave it out. If it helps your case, please, please, please submit that with your response. And as I keep mentioning, each solicitation is a clean slate, right? So whether or not you've had a contract with us before or have a contract with us now, when you submit to a new RFP or a new solicitation, you're submitting back at ground one, right? So just make sure that you guys are aware of that and preparing your response. And I mentioned before, we've had a few vendors that did not receive an award or didn't score as highly as they wanted to because they didn't put their best foot forward, assuming that the committee was familiar with them as a company because they've had contracts with us in the past. Keep in mind that the committee is composed of very different individuals, all with different backgrounds, just to make sure, like I said, that the review process is unbiased. So you have to resell yourself with every solicitation. Don't assume that the committee or any committee member is familiar with your work because they may not be. So this is your chance again to put your best foot forward and really make sure that you're submitting in a way that lets the committee know that you're able and capable to do this work and fulfill the contract need. So after proposals are evaluated, again, this is where oral presentations come in. So after we do the technical response, which is the proposed methodology, the cover letters, executive summary, key personnel, that first part, the committee will decide whether or not to have oral presentations. And these are conducted to allow vendors the opportunity to address any questions and concerns of the committee. They are typically requested with a short list of vendors via a formal letter. So you will receive a letter saying, hey, we would like to interview you for this project. When are you available? And then we'll confirm that availability and schedule the meeting with you all. Clarity for the committee is crucial in determining the award. So again, we want to make sure that you address all of the questions and concerns that were raised by that committee, because if there is anything outstanding, that can affect your score and your ability to actually be chosen for the contract. Also keep in mind that you're not going into this meeting blindly. The committee will already have a list of questions composed, and they'll send that to you all ahead of the oral presentation so that you are able to prepare your response to those questions and concerns during the meeting. So you'll be aware ahead of time on the points of discussion that you should be addressing before we actually get to the meeting. And then again, those presentations are scored by the committee, and that is part of the final determination for award, which is why it's important to address all of the concerns that the committee have, even if it's repetitive. Okay. So after the oral presentations, the committee or the buyer will reach out to you all for a best and final offer. And we do this because there may be items in the presentation that were addressed that can change the outcome of the pricing. And again, it's normally requested from the shortlisted vendors via a formal letter, and you're normally given a 48-hour turnaround time. And based on the outcome of the presentations, the vendors will be asked to provide their most favorable pricing structure to fulfill the contract. And as I mentioned, sometimes vendors may overestimate or underestimate the quantity of work that is needed, or the staff that might be needed, or the materials that might be needed for a contract. This is normally addressed in oral presentations, which is why we request the best and final offer to reevaluate the pricing to make sure it fits the need for the final contract, right? So the BAFO is requested after both the committee and the vendor have clarity on the scope and the need for this contract, so that you guys can, fully bake your final contract amount after both parties have a full understanding of your proposal itself. And the BAFO is scored by the committee, and this is the final piece of scoring. Once the BAFO is scored, that's it. There's no going back. There's no additional room for clarity or addressing concerns. Once that BAFO is scored, those vendors that have scored the highest will be the ones considered for award. So you want to make sure your BAFO is also competitive also, because you might be ranking with several other vendors depending on the number of contracts that are needed for that project. Okay. And so after the BAFO is scored and we have the final list of vendors that that the committee is gonna recommend for award, this is where the award recommendation phase starts, right? So the committee will make a recommendation and send that recommendation to the using agency for approval. Now, the using agency hasn't been reviewing the proposals. They're looking at a summary of the committee's findings just to get an idea of why the recommendation was made in the first place. And then they send OCPO, my department, a formal letter saying, hey, we agree with the findings, we agree with the recommendation. Let's move forward with presenting to the board. So that's what happens with that. And that's normally in the form of a formal letter from the using department to OCPO. And then the vendors that will not be considered for award will be notified of a formal letter that we will not be continuing with their proposal, but they're free to bid on other projects. And if we need to move past the vendors that are shortlisted, because in some instances, our shortlisted vendors or the recommended awardees may not pass the background check or the compliance review, we're able to move forward to the next lowest scoring vendor if that is the case. And that's noted in that letter also. Right, so once the recommendation is approved, this is where we get into the contract negotiation for an RFP. Now, this isn't so much negotiating the scope. Sometimes there may be tweaks to the scope, but we don't add or remove anything from the overall scope in general. This is where we're looking at the red lines that the vendor submitted. And I believe in the first meeting that we had, I mentioned that, we provide the full PSA or our professional service agreement. That's the county contract. We provide the full contract template in our solicitation document as an exhibit for each vendor to review, right? Because once you sign that contract, you are bound to all the terms and conditions within it. So if there is any issue or disagreements with any of the terms and conditions in the contract, vendors are free to provide red lines and alternative language to the terms and conditions. So that's what the contract negotiation is referring to. Sometimes it does apply to the scope, where we're saying, hey, we thought we needed this part, but we don't remove that. Or, you have too many staff for this area, can you please revisit that kind of thing? That can be negotiated as well, but it's primarily the T's and C's of our contract. So if a vendor is taking any exceptions or providing any alternative language, they must also provide a rationale for that exception or the alternative language. But they're absolutely free to do that. And again, alternative language is submitted for consideration. OCPO does not have to approve that language. And all of the negotiation or the PSA red lines have to be reviewed by our legal department, right? So they review the red lines and the alternative language. They either approve it and say, hey, we're good with this, or if we can't approve the red line or the alternative language, we'll provide an alternative to the vendor. So that back and forth can be pretty lengthy because both parties need to agree before we can move forward with executing the contract. So keep that in mind also, that the negotiation period can add another month or two to the timeline, depending on how many exceptions or the alternative language that the vendor submitted with their response. And it has to be agreed upon by both the OCPO and the vendor, as well as the using agency as well, because they're the ones who are going to be managing the contract themselves. It's actually their needs, so we want to make sure that they're abreast to any of the changes to the terms and conditions as well. So after the contract has been negotiated, again, we get into the background check and the UP review. I won't dive down into this too much more because we kind of already talked about it with the RFQ process, but it's pretty much the same. Those submittal documents like the EDS and the compliance utilization plan are being reviewed by several different departments. So it's important that you guys fill those out correctly and completely. We want to make sure there are no missing signatures, there are no sections missing, because some of those documents are pretty lengthy, but the background check would be the next step. And once the vendor has passed the background check and a utilization plan review, then we get into the board approval. And again, this is for contracts where the value is $150,000 or above. They have to be reviewed and approved by the Board of Commissioners. There's a board meeting held every month except the month of August. So September is normally like a month of overload for board approval, because everyone who couldn't get on the July board has to now go to the September board because we didn't have an August board meeting. And like I said, the board reviews the recommendation for award and provides approval. The CPO can execute the contract after the board approves, and the buyer can notify vendors of award after the board approves. And then the final contract document and the purchase order are sent to the vendor and the using agency, and this is the okay to actually begin work. Okay. So in summary, the RFP and the RFQ are forms of competitive solicitations where the scope is more complex in nature, so the responses need to be evaluated to make sure that the response fits the need and is most qualified to fulfill the contract. Evaluation criteria aids in the proposal and qualification development for the vendor, and it also helps the committee select the best vendor to meet the need. Responses must be submitted in Bonfire, and in a second, I'm gonna go into the Bonfire demo, just so you guys can see how to navigate the site. But again, when we go into our session on OCPO documents and OCPO websites, we'll dive further down into Bonfire, but I'll give you guys a quick snippet right after this. The committee is tasked with reviewing the responses and recommending the award with the most qualified vendor. And then negotiations are conducted along with BAFOs for RFPs, but this is what's different from the IFB. We can negotiate pricing and terms with an RFP and RFQ. So any questions before I get into the Bonfire demo?
Let me just come behind and provide a follow-up to that question earlier for Mr. Hill. So I did check that out, and it is correct that if you are an MBE wanting to self-perform on a contract, you do have the ability to do that, assuming that your scope of work, your codes, everything else is applicable. However, if you want to par out some of the work, you are able to par that out to a subcontractor, but because you are self-performing, you have to perform at least 51% of the work yourself. So those are two options that you have. You can self-perform 100% of the contract, or as an MBE, you can self-perform 51% and par out the other 49%. Let me look and see if there are any questions in here. You're welcome, Mr. Hill. Do contracts require committee or subcommittee approval before going to the full board for approval?
So that depends on the nature of the contract and what we are requesting. There are a couple that have a committee, like the steering committee has to review, or the vehicle committee has to review, when we have purchases for vehicles and things like that. It depends on the nature of that particular project, but that's only a small percentage of them. Most of them do not have a subcommittee. The evaluation committee will review and then take it straight to the board.
All right. I don't see any other questions. You can go ahead.
Okay, can you see my Bonfire screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll again provide the link to our Bonfire portal in the chat, or I'll give it to Dr. Butler to provide you all in case you guys haven't registered. But part one of this is go ahead and register on the Bonfire vendor portal, because you have to be registered in order to receive notifications from us and to see solicitations pertinent to Cook County. There are multiple agencies across Chicago and Cook County in the state of Illinois that use Bonfire, but all of our systems are different. So just because you're registered in Bonfire in general doesn't mean you'll receive our notifications, right? And just because you're registered with us doesn't mean you'll see the city of Chicago's. Like, we're separate entities with separate portals in Bonfire. I want to make sure I point that out because we have gotten that question before. So I'll send the link for our specific Cook County Bonfire vendor portal so you guys can see our opportunities. And so this is what the portal will look like once you are registered and you've selected your commodity codes. And again, we'll get into that in a session specific for our websites. But this is a glimpse of what you'll see on the actual portal. This is the live portal for Cook County. You'll see a list of all of our open opportunities, the contract numbers, the description of the project itself, the department requesting that project, and when that project close date is going to occur. So this date is important. I want to make sure that you guys are well aware of how much time you have to actually submit your proposal when you open the opportunity. So the first step when you are interested in a specific project, let's say you want to submit to this snowplow trucks solicitation, all you would do is click View Opportunity. And once it loads, I can show you the rest. Okay, so View Opportunity is going to give you a summary of the project itself. When you click View Opportunity, that does not take you directly to the solicitation documents, directly to the submittal requirements. It's just an overview of the project. And if you're further interested, I'll show you how to dive down into the specifics. But if you just want to see a summary, this is where you do that. It shows you again, some of the more basic information about the project in the department, due dates, so when questions were due, when the solicitation opened, and when it's going to close. There's also a calendar here that shows that same information. And here's another list of the events that has come or has passed already. It shows you that here. This section right here will show you the commodity codes that are listed for this particular project. And again, I want to make sure you guys are aware to please select any and all commodity codes that apply to your area of work, because this is the way that you'll increase your ability to be notified of our opportunities. Simply selecting one code, you're going to limit yourself in what you're able to see. So if you are a company that deals with electricians, you want to make sure you have construction codes, repavement codes. You want to make sure you have rehab codes, all the codes that could potentially use an electrician, so that you're notified of the opportunity, right? And again, we use the UNSPC codes, and I can provide the link to that as well. But it's outlined on our portal when you guys set up your registration. The next part of the summary, you're going to see supporting documentation. So these are housed here as a reference. You'll see the actual solicitation document, and then the supplemental forms we're asking you guys to submit. This is not everything that's required in the RFP. Those will be specified in the solicitation document. These are documents that you may have to download and submit and upload again, because these are documents that we just use all the time. So we've housed them here as a reference for you all. You can download them and fill them out here, or review them here if you need to. And then this is the section that you guys should pay the most attention to, because all of these documents listed here that has a green required button, you have to submit something in that slide in order to complete your proposal. Now, for this particular solicitation, the buyer itemized only 2 items: the main submission package, so you guys can lump everything together, all of those attachments, and then the pricing sheet. For some RFPs, these documents are itemized, and I'll look for one of those in a second, but they'll have a separate requirement for the cover letter, the executive summary, your past approach, your org chart, and key personnel, and you cannot move forward with your submission until all of these items have a document submitted in them. I just want to make sure that that's clear also. And, once you guys get in the portal, you'll get familiar with that as you navigate it. Another important section of the opportunity summary is this document takers. This section here will show you all every vendor that looked at this opportunity to show interest, the number of files that they looked at, and then whether or not they are certified NBE, WBE, and the certifying agency. So if you guys are Prime and you're looking for a sub to fulfill your NBE goal, this is where you can see some information about vendors who are certified who also have interest in this opportunity as a way to help you guys meet that goal. If you are a MBE vendor and you set this up on your profile, this will show here when you view the opportunity. And then you can view that vendor's profile by clicking view, and it'll pull up their contact information, maybe an email if you wanted to reach out to network. You are able to do that also. But the key thing that I want to point out is, in order to see the specific solicitation documents or the specific requirements or to submit a response, you have to actually click on prepare your submission. Again, simply opening the opportunity will give you a summary. It won't give you the specifics just yet. We get that question a lot, which is why I thought it was important to go through this whole tutorial. So I'm just going to go ahead and click prepare submission. I'm not going to actually submit it. Hold on a second, but I want you guys to see what it looks like when you're on the submission screen. So here is where you would have to upload your file for the submission package and any other supporting documentation that is itemized on this bid or on the RFQ. And then this one has an actual bid table attached. Some of the buyers actually allow you to submit pricing directly in the browser. If the pricing sheet is complex, there'll be an attachment A or an Excel document that you have to complete, but either way, you'll be able to see that document here. And for this particular one, there's a bid table within the browser. So all you have to do is review each of the line items and submit your unit pricing directly in the browser. It'll calculate the total cost for you, and then you're done. Once you actually submit your response, then you can go back and download the total pricing sheet with your input in it, with your unit pricing in it already. You won't be able to see that until you actually submit your response, which I'm not going to do because this is the live portal. But just wanted you guys to see how to navigate Bonfire if you haven't already had the ability to do so. Are there any questions about the portal itself?
Let's see. Can a subcontractor submit proposal on the portal if the prime isn't registered on Bonfire?
So anyone is able to submit a response, but if you are a sub and you won't be fulfilling the full contract, I would recommend working with a prime. So make sure that that prime is registered and you're part of their response. That's really important too. Although anyone can submit one, it works better for you as a sub to submit with a prime. So let the prime submit their contract with you on it. Does that answer the question? I hope so.
Let's see. Let me see. He said yes.
Okay, great.
Let me look. I did drop the Cook County Bonfire portal link in the chat.
Oh, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. And someone asked, who do we contact if we have follow-up questions about this presentation?
You can contact me or Dr. Bowler. She'll relay any questions to me. We can put my email address in the chat and you can reach out if you guys have any additional questions. But we'll make sure that you guys have the presentation sent to you.
Correct. Okay. That's all I have right now. I don't see any hands raised.
Okay. Then while we have time, let me go to the website that we use for our commodity codes. Give me 1 second. And I believe I put the link for this in the chat before, but just want to make sure anyone who wasn't at that meeting is aware of this as well. So a lot of different agencies may use different codes depending on how they're registered, but Cook County, we use the UNSPC commodity codes. If you've never used those codes before, you can find those codes easily on the home screen. You can either, if you know the contract code number, you can search for the number here, or you can search for the code name. So I'm just gonna, as a test, type in paper and hit search. And it'll bring up every commodity code that's associated with paper, right? So you can, when you get to Bonfire and you're registering for your codes, you can put in the exact number or you can put in the description here and it'll do the same thing. It pulls from this database. But if you guys want to get familiar with the naming conventions of our codes, this is where you do that. But again, Bonfire will also walk you through the codes that we use when you register on our site. Just wanted to make sure you guys had that information also. And I'll go through these in more detail on the session specific to our sites and our submittal documents. But were there any other questions about what we have discussed today? Anything that you guys wanted to see that I didn't discuss, or?
Let's see. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, please raise your hand. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, please raise your hand. I'm looking. I think you did a really good job, Sheena, of sharing the information. I know it was a lot of information and people will probably have to go and look at it again.
Okay.
Because trying to just take it all in and then having a chance to go back and look at it once they can, like, after they've seen it one time and now they can actually look at it or listen to it objectively or subjectively. Okay, so I don't think we have any questions. Everybody is saying thank you very much. Great job. So you all, I did put in the chat the link to the Bonfire the Bonfire link in the chat. That's directly to Cook County. I also put in there Sheena's email address. You all also have the complianceoutreach.info email address, which is the email address that sent you all the reminder that we were going to be here today. So you can send, that's the email address for my division. So you can definitely send an email there, and I'll make sure that Sheena gets your question. And the only other thing that I want to say is we are doing a series. So this series is 5 parts. Next week, we're skipping a week. The next one will be August the 6th. However, I'm going to start sending out registration link, or a lot of the emails that were sent out before has the registration link for all 5 parts at the bottom. So if you want to go back through those emails from from the Office of Contract Compliance and go ahead and register for the August 6th class, that August 6th class is going to be on, what is it on, Sheena?
I want to say the IFB process will be next.
Yes, the IFB process. So the IFB process is going to be next. And Sheena, you want to tell them what the acronym stands for?
Invitation for bid. So this is a solicitation that is where the award is solely based on price. So it's not as complex as the RFP, but there still are a lot of components that we want to discuss that will be useful to you all in preparing your response.
All right. So you all, that's all we have. Let me look in the chat one last time to make sure. Oh, we do have one question. Olivia tried to slip one in there real quick. We were just getting ready to close up shop, Olivia. Are you able to see or open your uploads and documents submitted from previous opportunities?
Yeah, you should be able to. So all of your submissions will be saved under your profile. So if you go to, let me see if I can get back to the portal. Give me 1 second. Uh-oh. If you go to the portal, you should be able to see something called My Past Opportunities. And this is where you will see everything that you have submitted and all the documents pertaining to things you have submitted. If you have any, yes, you can see that.
All right, and I'm answering this question. So her email's in the chat and you will get a copy of the chat notes. So I meant to let everybody know, you'll also get a copy of the chat notes. So you'll be able to grab the email, Sheena's email. And also I mentioned that you can email me directly through the email that I sent that reminds you all that you would be here. So you have a number of different ways to get in touch with us. So just utilize those methods.
And before we conclude the session, I do want to point out again that the series that we're dedicating to our solicitation documents, our templates, our forms, and our websites, that is going to be a crucial series. Our forms can be somewhat complex. hard to put together, hard to read and understand. So we just want to make sure that we provide you guys clarity on those documents because it does matter when it comes to the responsiveness check. So please, please, please attend that series as well. We'll make sure we actually go through demos of each document, what each part of the document is for, and what we're looking for when it comes to the submittal requirements. So make sure that you guys are registering for that course as well.
Yep, and and in the follow-up email, so I'll send the follow-up email today before I leave for the day. So you'll get the follow-up email that will have the link to the replay, our YouTube channel. It'll have the chat notes, it'll have the slide deck, it'll have all of that by the end of the day today. So you'll have everything that you need to, and I will also include the link to sign up for the August 6th class as well. All right, well, thank you all so much. Sheena, as always, thank you for your expertise. It's always extremely thorough. We're very grateful for your time. You all, please stay connected to the Office of Contract Compliance for this class and the other classes. We have a lot of stuff that we're going to be providing you all throughout the end of our year. So please stay connected to us as well. And we hope to see you all on August the 6th for our IFB class. You guys take care. Have a wonderful rest of your day.